Thanks, Paula. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I know it's a busy time of year, as Paula said, so it's great to see so many people willing to participate this week. So this training tonight is our core zoning basics for enforcement officials and board members. We designed the course to help basically both zoning enforcement officials and zoning board members we know often come to the work as volunteers or as your paid employment if you're a zoning enforcement officer, not necessarily having any prior experience working with zoning. If you're a property owner in your community, you may never actually encounter your local zoning law or ordinance because you just don't have a need to look into it. And then you volunteer for your board, and suddenly you need to not only have some understanding of it, you're going to be charged with interpreting it, deciding whether or not to provide relief from it, and then just how to use it generally. So we thought this was a good course to develop to basically go over some of the fundamentals of reading zoning, some things to look out for, some tips, how many of the common tools are used. We do recognize that zoning is local, so there is no zoning regulation that's the same in every community, which does create challenges for putting something like this together, because obviously you're going to have things that may be slightly different from your neighbors or very different from your neighboring communities. So this is not intended to, we can't essentially create a course that meets all of your local needs, but this is something that is intended to take those elements that are very common amongst, or some version thereof are very common in most zoning, and just provide some basics for you as you're using your zoning laws and some of the things to look out for to help you do your job, essentially. So with that, we will get started. So what is zoning? Just some fundamentals. Zoning is any local law or ordinance regulating land use, location, lot area, and structural requirements. Whether or not you refer to your local land use regulations as zoning, whether that's the title or whether you call it by some other name, if it's providing those that regulation, then you have some form of zoning. And as you'll see from the stats on the screen, and these stats are getting a little bit dated. We'll have new ones in 2026, but approximately 78% of all local governments have some form of zoning. And it's intended to guide land use, site development, control for density, and generally support compatible growth. That includes infill development and protecting community resources. But the term compatibility really has been part of zoning since its inception. So-called Euclidean zoning, as we first referred to traditional zoning, was about separating incompatible uses. The purpose of it was to prevent fire hazards and other threats to health and safety by separating things like residential from industrial and things like that. So the term compatibility has always been part of the zoning concept. Today, zoning has evolved, and we like to think that zoning is more about allowing for more uses that are compatible by addressing concerns that might make for incompatibilities and being proactive about those things and addressing them up front so that you can allow for more uses to coexist. And so in addition, zoning can be used to target development to certain areas of a community, typically those supported by infrastructure. If a community has made public investments in infrastructure, you're going to want to target growth to those areas. And then there may be areas of your community that are inappropriate for development, whether it's things like steep slopes or flood-prone areas, things of that nature where you're going to want to avoid development in those areas. You know, as a proactive measure, especially as we continue to see more and more extreme weather events, that's what zoning is able to do. And then in addition, it will establish a process for project review and approval. And one of the interesting things about zoning generally is that statute provides certain process requirements for certain types of review, and there are some other tools incorporated into statute that are authorized for local governments to then adopt at the local level. But by and large, zoning is really what you want it to be or what you make of it at the local level. There's not a lot of guidance in statute. The other place where there's been, where we have shaped zoning is through our courts. There have been a lot of court decisions that have really helped or which have guided how zoning functions today, and has some of our decisions on what is considered to be legal zoning have come out of those court decisions. So there's not so much in statute as there is case law and things of that nature, and then otherwise it really is mostly a local process. So modern zoning has shifted a bit. We do now talk more about compatibility, but on its face, it still is intended to help a community maintain existing character, enhance community character. It can guide future development to be cohesive or aesthetically pleasing in similarity to what you may have today. It carries on that character, and then it can maintain character, that sense of place that you have, what makes your community what it is, what keeps you there, why do you come back. That sense of place can be preserved partially through zoning, not completely, but it is one of the main tools for doing so. And it can allow for and encourage compatible land uses. We're seeing more interest in mixed-use neighborhoods, mixed-use hamlets and villages, where people want to be able to live and recreate, walk to stores, walk to services, and so that walkability component can be supported through zoning. It can also be and is used in large part to protect sensitive environmental areas such as scenic resources, water resources, drinking water protection, farmland protection, those prime ag soils. Those can all, to some extent, be protected through zoning decisions. You can create more walkable communities, and then you can address hot button issues and some of those land uses that you do have concerns about. So statute requires that all communities with zoning have a zoning board of appeals. So that is a statutory requirement for any community with zoning. The purpose of the zoning board of appeals is to provide a quasi-judicial role that allows someone who either needs relief from zoning or disagrees with a determination of whether or not their proposed land use activity is in conformance with zoning, that instead of having to go to state Supreme Court to seek relief, they can go to a local board to seek that relief or an interpretation. So the early fathers of zoning recognize, and the courts recognize, the need for the Zoning Board of Appeals, and there's been a Board of Appeals in place starting in 1925, because there was a recognition that zoning is the regulation of private property, and that there will be unique circumstances or scenarios that zoning won't necessarily be addressing, and or that there may be scenarios where relief from zoning should be provided, and there needs to be a mechanism to do that. So that's what the Zoning Board of Appeals is about. It's a buffer between aggrieved applicants and having to go to state Supreme Court, and you spend that effort. And there's also a recognition that zoning isn't going to be perfect, and it will change over, the desires of a community will change over time, and it can be difficult to keep zoning up to date with every fast-paced world that we live in. And so that provides an opportunity to seek relief if zoning does not allow for exactly what somebody is proposing. So hopefully, if you have zoning, you do have a Zoning Board of Appeals, as they will be that important in-between mechanism for seeking relief. The zoning statute also requires that there be a zoning administrator, and that person's role will at a minimum be enforcement of zoning provisions, as well as the last bullet under administrative roles, making determinations related to whether or not a land use activity is compliant with zoning. There are other roles under the other administrative roles that a zoning administrator can have. They can be the first point of communication for any applicant who has questions. They can be providing all support to the Zoning Board of Appeals and Planning Board and other land use boards in terms of preparing materials, applications, answering questions. They can even be secretaries for the boards, hold all records, and maintain all records, take in all applications, review them, work with the applicants. So it can be a significant role that one person provides both that as well as the enforcement side. And on the enforcement side, it's taking in complaints about whether or not property owners are complying with zoning, conducting investigations, doing inspections of properties, working with those property owners to mitigate any of and remediate anything that may be out of compliance, hoping that that is the result, is that they become compliant. And if that compliance does not take place, other enforcement actions for property violations. So it can be a wide-ranging role, and it can be one of multiple hats that the staff person has. They may also be the building inspector, the flood plain administrator, the MS4 coordinator. They might do fire inspections. So it really can be quite an undertaking. So we do encourage that if you find yourself to be a zoning enforcement officer, and hopefully we have an administrator, hopefully we have some on today, if you are overwhelmed and you do feel like you don't have the capacity, other staff can serve in some of these roles. You can have clerks, secretaries, part-time positions that provide some of these same supporting roles to take off some of that pressure, and so that it works better for the review boards, the applicants, and for your own work. So zoning determinations are a really important part of all of it sort of kicks off the process for whether or not a land use activity can move forward. And depending upon that zoning determination, it sets certain things in motion. The zoning determination should be a written document that communicates whether or not a proposed land use activity meets zoning, is compliant with zoning. And in doing that interpretation, the zoning administrator should be applying the zoning law or ordinance as written. It is not their role to interpret things, or if they disagree with something, to make a make a different application to what the zoning says for different scenarios. Is to apply it as written. And in addition, anything that's written into zoning cannot be waived by the zoning administrator. Relief must be sought either through the Zoning Board of Appeals, or if a waiver provision is in zoning, whatever review board is given the authorization to waive certain requirements, they might be able to do so as part of their review process, but it is not something that's done at the zoning administration level unless there's something written explicitly in zoning that gives them the authority to waive a specific provision. In terms of what the zoning determinations look like, your local law may have a zoning permit process whereby that zoning administrator is going to actually issue a zoning permit. A lot of zoning laws and ordinances do not have that provision, and if you don't have that provision or some other one written into your local law, then it's really up to you what instrument it's up to your community what instrument is used to provide those zoning determinations. But it does have to be something written. So it could be a zoning determination or compliance form. It could be a certificate of compliance. It could be a letter to the applicant stating whether or not their proposal meets zoning, and if it doesn't, what is in violation, what would be in violation, and the remedy that they could seek. But it is a written document that does need to be provided to the applicant, and it should be in their record that's kept, and once those determinations are made, a copy should go to the review board, especially if it's a zoning board of appeals matter. And one of the most important reasons for the written communication, other than it be that record, is there should be a date stamped to those zoning determinations, because statute says that an applicant or other party with standing that disagrees with a zoning enforcement officer's determination can seek an interpretation from the ZBA. They have 60 days from the date of the decision, so that zoning determination, to seek that interpretation. So that date on those determinations is key, and so there's that 60-day window. If an applicant understands and doesn't have a concern that there's been a misinterpretation of the zoning, but they do know they need relief and they want to seek that relief, they would then take that determination. They should understand what they need relief from, and then they would go seek relief from the Zoning Board of Appeals in the form of an area variance or a use variance request. And again, technically that 60-day window applies there as well. However, it's fairly common that if you don't have your application in yet, that is something you'd still be allowed to do in those situations where you're going to go seek a variance. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Paula.
Great. Okay, so we'll talk about some of the typical, zoning regulations that not only zoning enforcement officers will be working with, but also, planning and zoning board members as well. So it really starts with the basis of your zoning regulations. So your text provisions, all your zoning codes should have kind of this very basic thing. So the statutory source of power and intent, and that includes referencing your comprehensive plan, since it serves as the foundation of all of your land use regulations. And it's something that you should be You should have at your meetings, you should be able to, read and look at your comprehensive plan. It's important. It's kind of a living document. It should be kind of telling you the view of your community on like where you're at and where you're looking to go, and hopefully your zoning is in alignment with that. So you make sure that you want to make sure that that's around. The other big one, of course, is definition. So super important if you're defining the uses that exist in your community, or your zoning board of appeals is going to be probably doing a lot of interpretations. References to your official zoning map and the establishment of zoning districts. So a lot of times we're asked, like, when is it time to update our zoning? And usually that's because maybe there's uses that are proposed that didn't exist the last time you updated your zoning, or it could just be you're having a really difficult time, or the zoning enforcement officer is having a really difficult time interpreting and reading your zoning map. So that's usually like the big flag that, hey, it's time to do this. So want to make sure that your zoning regulations are also referencing that official zoning map, and then of course the establishment of those zoning districts throughout. Relationship to other regulations. So this is if there are regulations in your local zoning that are more strict than state regulations. Usually the more strict local zoning law applies, except for things where the state kind of occupies the field. And one of those places in which they do is the New York State Uniform Fire Prevention and Building Code, which establishes kind of the minimum of building codes in New York State. So for a municipality to be to have more restrictive building code in their municipality, they'd have to go through the process here at the Department of State with the Codes Council. The other one to keep in mind is your site plan or your subdivision review. If you're a community that doesn't combine your zoning into like one land use law. Sometimes it's easier in communities, especially if maybe your zoning is not that complicated, to put your site plan, subdivision, special use permits, criteria all into the same place with your zoning law, so it's easier to kind of cross-reference, but again, up to you on how you handle that. Your zoning should also pretty much set up the permitting process in your municipality, as well as administrative enforcement and the appeals process, which is super important, of course, for the enforcement officer, since it basically kind of lines up what they do. And then, of course, saving and severability clauses. Savings clauses are more about protecting pre-existing non-conforming uses that existed before the zoning law changed. And severability is for if your local zoning law is challenged and parts of it are held to be illegal or otherwise unenforceable, the remainder of the zoning law still applies throughout the municipality. So that's the basics. And then for zoning districts and maps, again, zoning, as Monica kind of opened this up this evening, is kind of divides a municipality into zones or districts that regulate the land use activity in those zones. So it should define the permitted uses and lot configurations and the kind of development and the scale of said development in those zones, and maybe some other development considerations, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides here. Each district might have a statement of intent or purpose, which is intended to provide context for the goal of the zone. Things like what types of existing and land use activities and development character is the zone attempting to support. And then most newer zoning maps usually follow parcel lines or physical features like roads or water bodies, just because it's a lot easier to kind of deal with those. But also if you're a community that has seen a lot of like maybe parcel changes over time, it might be a little different than that. But if you have parcels that are located in more than one zoning district, Your zoning text should provide direction on who will interpret and how. Hopefully that's not really a problem in hopefully there's like small instances of that happening. It might be the larger piece of the parcel kind of prevails in terms of use and development, but again, hopefully you don't have too many of those. All right. Then you might also have places in your community where that are like have sensitive or unique areas, or scenarios where you might want to have more or less regulation. So maybe you have a natural feature that overlaps district boundaries, like a waterfront or a floodplain or steep slopes or an aquifer that's used as a water source. Or it could be that it's a smaller area than your zoning districts. That's where we see things like gateways or downtowns or a historic area. And the overlay might add additional standards, or it might open additional opportunities for development in those places. So for example, there might be stricter standards about building envelopes on the waterfront, which makes sense because it's a sensitive area. But you might have more uses that are allowed because waterfronts typically create economic opportunity, and a lot of municipalities want to try to encourage that. So you might have things like marinas or docks or boat rentals or boat tours. So you might have more activity happening there, but maybe not as much of a physical presence in terms of the buildings. The example on the slide here is the town of Bridgewater from Oneida County. It has a mapped land conservation overlay along a river corridor, and it also has an aquifer protection overlay, which was established after doing a groundwater protection study delineating an aquifer protection boundary. And I think over time, water protection is going to be probably a bigger hot button issue in the future, just because we're starting to see more things like pollution, but also just more water intensive uses happening in communities. So something to keep in mind there. And then your overlay protections or boundaries may have text that clarify the boundary. So things like an example like 500 feet from the mean high water mark of the lake or the shoreline. And a thing about overlay and special use districts, make sure that you check for the narrative for any guidance on the boundaries of some overlay zones. And that's mostly because the representation on the map might kind of show you where it is, but the text might be more specific and kind of explain as to why and how you define the boundary and kind of what was thought at the time when you put that boundary into place. So for the town of Bridgewater, I think it's 200 feet on either side of the shoreline at the normal water level of streams and waterways, and such additional areas are delineated on the map. Super important, of course, for the zoning enforcement officer that's going to be going out there and actually going through the process of measuring. All right, so looking at some of the maps that are out there, most of New York State is pretty rural, so we typically see more rural zoning, obviously, in those places. And a lot of times in rural communities, they have a simpler framework for their zoning than places like cities or maybe super suburbanized larger towns. But in some cases, this is also where you need to be more thoughtful about what kind of development you're trying to attract to your community or maybe trying to discourage, because you typically have more hypothetical scenarios that might come through your community than built-out communities who are really just reacting to development changes in already developed areas. So if you have a lot of open space, thinking holistically about what you want to see and not see is pretty important. So here in the town of Greenwich in Washington County, we have a small number of zones, about 5 or 6, which kind of covers everything, and it's usually probably pretty easy to administer because it looks like really the south western part of the town is really where you're seeing probably the most amount of development, or and looks like it's the most like densely developed as well. Whereas kind of everything else typically falls into that rural agricultural zone. So again, probably dependent on what amenities you have in your municipality. And then an example for a more complex example, so we are looking down in the Hudson Valley in the town of Red Hook, which is interesting because they have also 2 villages that have their own zoning as well. So the town doesn't oversee that because that's up to the villages to do themselves. But here you actually see where they have about 15 different zoning districts, and they have, I think, 4 overlay districts that are related to flooding, to national landmarks, to environmental protection, and a scenic corridor overlay. So again, in this community, you're probably, again, still probably what we would call rural in most places. They definitely have more development pressure, especially since 2020 and COVID. So again, for them, because of the fact that there's a lot going on there, they have a more complex set of zoning districts and regulations, and also have those several overlays and several residential districts that drive different lot sizes for development as well. And then our more developed areas, you might end up in communities that have multiple maps. So here it's the city of Troy, which is what we would call probably a small city by most standards, but still has a lot going on. So for them, they have 2 maps. So one drives land uses, the other drives lot development and form that across the entire city. And this allows for greater flexibility in how land uses and site development are regulated. And sometimes this is really helpful because you're trying to convey a lot of information. So sometimes it's easier to break it down into different maps. But most likely, it's going to most likely in cities be a little bit more complex in terms of your zoning regulations. But a lot of times in cities and more developed places, you typically have more professional planning staff that might be there to not only just support the boards, but also support the zoning administrator, or your professional planner might actually be the zoning administrator. So here in the city of Troy, they use 2 maps. The one on the left-hand side is for permitted land uses. The one on the right is for lot dimensional standards, with 2 sets of zones that convey different information. So I think we'll see probably more of this in more of our developed communities across New York. And then down the way here in the capital city, because I live in the city of Albany, so this is my city. We have a different zoning map framework. It took us a long time to get a comprehensive plan, and then it took us a long time to get a very overhaul of the zoning code. This is where we use, for some of the neighborhoods, we use regulating plans and a more form-based approach. So we have 2 distinct maps for what we call our warehouse neighborhood. And one on the left addresses land uses, and the one on the right addresses buildings and frontages that are based on the type of street. So in this one, it's collector streets versus local neighborhood streets, and kind of gives you an idea of what the form that they're looking for. So I think there's very few municipalities that have gone fully form-based, but some typically do it by certain neighborhoods where they're trying to achieve more of a look. So that might be something that you might consider in your community as well. Okay, with that, I am going to turn it back over to our zoning guru, Monica, to talk about some permitted uses.
Thanks, Paula. All right, so now we're going to dive into if you are looking at your zoning, how to interpret what is permitted. That's essentially this next section. So the first thing we will point out is that your permitted land uses are using that same framework of zoning districts. Almost all zoning laws and ordinances use that framework to decide what land uses are going to be permitted in different zones. And so each district likely has a list of permitted land uses. And the way most laws are written, anything that's listed is permitted. If it's not listed, it's prohibited. So, and you may have language that states that expressly, that says, only all the following uses are permitted, and anything not listed is prohibited. Or it may just say the following is a list of permitted uses. You will also see lists of, you might see a short list of prohibited uses that might be municipality-wide or that are specific to certain zones. Those are typically not exhaustive lists of prohibited uses. Those are certain things that activities that your municipality may have decided they wanted to make very clear are not permitted by listing them specifically. But that doesn't mean that those are the only uses prohibited. And then within that, there's different types of permissions. So if you hear the term as of right or by right, that typically refers to a land use that's permitted that doesn't need any other reviews or approvals as it pertains to zoning. The use may need a building permit because it triggers the building code, but it doesn't necessarily need anything else from zoning. And then there are uses that are permitted but might require site plan review. And we'll talk briefly about site plan review in a few slides. Or it could be a use that requires a special use permit. And special use permits often, but not always, also may require site plan review as well. So there are different levels of permissiveness that zoning will articulate. And we'll talk about special use permits as well in a minute. So cautionary note, if you have zoning that after the list of permitted uses includes in that list other uses, other materially similar uses, or other uses of equal or less intensity, some language to that effect, that language was likely put in there because there was concern that you might miss some uses that you meant to allow, and language like that might feel like it provides a good sort of catch-all for some things that maybe get forgotten when you're doing a zoning update or writing your first zoning. The problem with that language can be how to interpret that. It can be really wide-ranging in how that's interpreted because it isn't. Those are typically fairly loose language, and somebody's going to need to make that interpretation. And it would start with the zoning administrator who interprets your zoning, and then if, depending upon their decision, if the potential applicant or somebody inquiring is not satisfied with that determination, they may seek an interpretation from the Zoning Board of Appeals, or your zoning might actually be specific about who makes those interpretations and may say that they go to the Zoning Board of Appeals. In either case, it can be difficult to be consistent in how you're applying that, because what do those terms really mean? What is more or less intense? That can very much be in the eye of whoever is sitting there that day making that interpretation. And your boards will change and your staff might change and they may look at it a different way. So what we would say is really document how you came to the decision that if it is or is not a similar use or of equal or less intensity. Make sure you really document how you came to that conclusion and be consistent in how you're applying that language. Consistency is really a theme you'll hear throughout this when you are faced with making interpretations of your local laws. When there is wiggle room, documentation and consistency are key. And then we would also recommend, if you have an opportunity to update your zoning, we would always recommend eliminating that language, and there are other ways in which to try to capture a more general category of uses without having it so open-ended as that terminology. Okay, so in terms of what these permitted land use, how these things are illustrated in zoning, there's typically two ways. There's either narrative text with, like the one on the left side of your screen, that provides for each zoning district, hopefully a purpose or intent statement that Paula talked about earlier that sort of frames the intention of the zoning district, and then provides typically a list of permitted uses, and then usually a list, if there are any, of uses that will require a special use permit, or what might also be called a special exception or a conditional use permit, as the one on the screen here. And then there'll be a list of those as well. There might be some dialogue, some additional language, cross-references to other provisions related to some of these uses in those lists, but there would be a list for each zone. The alternative, or sometimes in addition, is to have a table like the one on the right side of the screen. And the way the tables work, and they typically consolidate many, if not all, zoning districts and their land uses into one table. Sometimes it takes a couple of tables, depending upon the size of the community and how they want to set it up. But you would have the zoning districts across the top, and then the land uses listed down the left side of the table, like the one on the screen. Sometimes they're lumped together by types of general land activity, residential versus commercial, maybe versus public service or institutional uses, or things like that. Or they might just be in alphabetical order and be one big long list of uses. And then within each cell, and this can vary from community to community, but you'll provide things like whether or not it's a permitted use, permitted with site plan review, permitted with a special use permit. Some tables put an N or something like that for not, or NP for not permitted, to make it clear it's not permitted in certain zones. And then the one on the screen here also provides cross-references to any additional standards that are required for certain uses. So that's also an option. This particular case, this is a table from the town of Lansing. And so they've provided a lot of information on this table. And the Z's actually refer to when just a zoning permit is required. You can really convey a lot of information on one table. And some of these things are not always incorporated, but these are two examples of what you would typically see. Some communities actually have the text as well as the table, and that's often the text is the sort of ruling, sort of the legal narrative, and the table is used because it's sometimes easier to find things, so they want the table as well, just more as a reference document. So sometimes you see both. And then when you're considering whether a land use is permitted, there's some things to keep in mind in making those determinations. And the first is that each land use activity should be defined in zoning. So every use that's listed on one of these tables or in these lists should have a definition in a definition section of zoning. This is not always the case. In fact, I would say it's often not the case, particularly if your zoning is a little bit older. I think we saw less comprehensive definition sections in our earlier zoning laws and ordinances than we, and hopefully that that comprehensive definition section will be developed when you do an update if you don't have it today. Because if a term that's listed is not defined, then you're sort of left to go and seek, come up with your own decision on what that term means. And so that zoning enforcement officer is going to have to do that, and then potentially, depending upon whether or not the applicant agrees with that, maybe the Zoning Board of Appeals is going to have to do the same. So we would recommend using common, if you don't have a definition, using common resources, things where you can find common definitions, and then apply those common definitions. If there's a variety of different definitions associated with a land use, try to refrain from cherry picking the definition that you want to suit a situation. You should be using what is most common, or at least taking in all of the definitions to arrive at whether or not the use is intended to be permitted. There are court cases that talk about a zoning board of appeals that that did sort of pick the definition to suit a narrative rather than looking at some of the basic definitions that came before the one they selected in that same resource. So that is a cautionary tale. And then again, apply consistency in terms of the resources you're using to find definitions, whether it's Webster's dictionary or a planner's dictionary, and then be consistent in how you're applying them. So that's one tip. And then the other thing is that some land use categories, as I mentioned before, to avoid missing some uses that you fully intended to allow but you just didn't think of them that day, are lumped together. So you'll have a broader category of retail uses, for example, retail establishments. And that would be a catch-all for retail generally, unless a specific retail use is also listed on the table. So if you look at the highlighted example here, you see retail establishments is a category not otherwise listed in this schedule. So if you look farther down, you'll see that vehicle sales, rental, and lease is listed. So if somebody is proposing a car dealership, then they would go with the vehicle sales definition. If somebody was proposing, say, a florist, and florists aren't listed, they would fall under retail establishments. And again, there should be a definition in the definition section that goes in more depth of what retail establishments mean. And it might specifically even, in that definition, exclude certain uses that are retail from that definition, to let the reader know that they're going to need to look for those uses elsewhere to find out whether or not, how they're defined and whether or not they're permitted. So another example of that that's on the screen would be service-related uses. That's another one where it could be a catch-all category, and then, but then there might be some service uses that are specifically listed. So that's something to just, this is more and more common. Part of it is to reduce the number of pages of zoning and to cut down on the sheer magnitude of the list of permitted uses. But it also provides that catch-all category for retail or service, or some, you might see light industrial as well. And then if there are concerns about really specific uses, they probably are listed separately, so look for that as well. And then when you're interpreting definitions, we have some tips here for that as well. So you're going to first consult that, hopefully you have that comprehensive glossary or section devoted to definitions. But and for the most part, hopefully things are defined there, but you often will find definitions embedded in the zoning itself. So, and there may not be a consistency about that. So be on the lookout for definitions folded into the zoning text and not included in the definitions in the back. Sometimes it's in both places. I think a common one is signage, where you will see the definitions of signage in the signage section in zoning. If you have sign regulations in zoning, you might find definitions right in that section that might not later be found in the regular zoning definition section. So do know that you might have to look elsewhere for those. And then other tips for interpreting definitions: don't assume the meaning of key terms just because you think you know what that term means. It doesn't really matter what you think it means. If it's defined, it's whatever that definition is. So make sure you're keeping in mind that you should be checking for definitions, especially for anything that's a really specific term that's used in zoning. And then focus on, don't focus on terms, focus on the definition itself. So there can be a term used that on most, in most people's minds, that's what that term means, is probably, the term used, we can use the recreational examples on the screen, what you would consider recreation. But you actually have to read the definition to see if it fits the activity that's proposed. Because in some instances, the term used may not fit the definition of the land use activity that's actually proposed. And you might need to look elsewhere, and it may pop up under some other definition, or it may not. And in that case, at least unless they get a variance, it's possible that that land use, whether it was intended or not, might not be allowed in that zoning. So very important to actually read the definitions and not assume that the term will meet the definition of the proposed land use activity before you. And then just some things to keep in mind: loaded terms that can be used in definitions. The phrase including but not limited to, or such as, and then you have some example land use activities. Those are examples, but it means that many other things could also be included in that definition, so that's not an exhaustive list. There might be exclusions specifically stated in definitions. And then if you see the term any, that's a very loaded term and really can potentially open the door to a lot of different things. If a definition starts out with any blah, 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 then it's possible that it could mean a wide-ranging number of things are permitted under that definition. And then just as an example here on the screen for recreational uses, you may have, and this could be not even a full list, 6 different types of recreation. There's recreation generally, which in a community that is rural and doesn't have a lot of different changes in the way your community is developed, you may need only a couple of definitions to really capture all of the recreational options. But then in larger communities where things change from neighborhood to neighborhood, and there's downtown areas or other scenarios, you may need a lot of definitions because you're trying to carve out certain types of recreation for different areas where it would be compatible. So that's just an example to show you how much thought really should go into the definition section and what you need to be considering. And then lastly, just on special use permits, we have a whole course on special use permits, and we talk a lot about them in our planning board overview course as well. But generally speaking, special use permits, if a use, in order to apply the special use permit review process, it needs to be stated in your zoning that that use requires a special use permit. You can't apply it to uses if it doesn't say to apply it in zoning. So you can't just use that because you think it would be a good idea. It has to actually say it in zoning. And then uses that require a special use permit are considered permitted uses, but they're uses that might need, in a particular unique scenario where they're proposed, they are reviewed for potential impacts. The tool can open up more possibilities for allowing uses because it allows you to review those uses for compatibility. So instead of prohibiting them, they're allowed with a special permit so that you can do that additional review and make sure that there aren't adverse impacts that can't be overcome. And then as long as your zoning provides criteria for review of special use permits and you use that criteria, you can place conditions on uses to mitigate concerns that you may have. And you can even potentially deny a special use permit in certain circumstances if your criteria is used and you do not feel like the unique activity, that the adverse impacts cannot be overcome. It is possible to also deny that use from going forward. But initially, it will be the zoning enforcement officer that interprets whether or not the special use permit is needed based on what's written in the zoning. And then there'll be a review board identified in zoning and they will take that review. The special use permit does need to be approved prior to a project moving forward. And it often is in conjunction with site plan review, but not always, but that is a common scenario. And both need to be approved before a building permit can be issued. And for more information on special use permits, you can see the citations on the screen there for the sections of law that cover special use permits. And then in addition to principal uses for properties, zoning likely covers accessory uses and structures and how they can be developed on a property. That it can be something that is a little harder to find and is a little less consistent from zoning law to zoning ordinance. So you will need to really look at your local zoning to understand how you address these uses and structures. But they are typically things like garages and sheds, pools, patios, maybe personal agriculture, home occupations or home-based businesses, accessory dwelling units, all of those uses and activities that are subordinate to a principal use of the property. So a couple of things to note about that is that we like to highlight structures, the term structure. If you're a code enforcement officer that also oversees the building code, zoning can have a different definition of structure. You know, in the case of zoning, you'll be applying it for the purposes of zoning, and then you would apply the building code for those standards that apply to the actual structure itself under the building code. Zoning typically covers things like where the accessory uses and structures can be located. They're often given leniency relative to principal uses, so usually they're allowed a little closer to the property lines in the rear and side yard. They're oftentimes not permitted in the front yard, in that front yard setback, so that's a common provision. But they are given some latitude, usually in terms of where else they are permitted within a property, but they might also be capped in terms of size or height, so you may have those provisions as well. On the screen here is an example where accessory structures and uses were covered in that permitted uses table. It's a section within that table. We also see separate tables of these uses, or just text discussion of how accessory uses can be developed in a community. And then for uses that existed prior to the adoption of zoning in its your first zoning law or ordinance, or uses that existed prior to an update to zoning, if they were legal under a prior code, or if they existed prior to zoning being implemented in the first place, those are considered pre-existing legal non-conforming uses, and they are offered a certain amount of protection in the fact that they are allowed to continue to function and operate as they did at the time of that new zoning. And that is something that has come out of case law. It's not something that's written into statute, but they are offered a certain amount of protection to continue. Once they are abandoned or cease to exist for some level of time, for some amount of time, then those properties would have to revert to a permitted use if your zoning addresses this. So and typically the time frame is 12 months, but it could be less, it could be more. And your local zoning may also have provisions for these uses to expand to some extent or make improvements within their current activity, but improvements to the property may be allowed. All of that is written into local laws, so that is something you will want to pay attention to. And then anything beyond whatever your zoning allows, if a legal pre-existing legal non-conforming use wants to expand, that would require a use variance unless your zoning allows for expansion. So that's something to keep in mind. It is a use variance because you're increasing the intensity of that use. You may also have language that sunsets certain provisions, so certain uses have to stop by after a certain number of years, and then they are amortized out over time. That typically is for minor investments, things like signage, not for principal uses of a property, although you might see that from time to time. And it's usually for minor investments so that they can, that depreciation over time can be written off, et cetera, and give them time to come into conformance with zoning. So it's not typically on larger scale uses within your community, but it is a provision that you want to check your local law to see how you address these types of existing land uses. If it's a use that was never legal or is an illegal activity, then that of course is not protected. All right, we are now going to shift to a discussion of the lot development standards, which is the other element typically covered under that framework of zoning districts. So it's land uses and then how a lot will be allowed to develop. And so it's the configuration of the lots themselves. It's about where development can take place on lots. And typically this is again driven by zoning districts. Or as Paula pointed out, there may be two separate maps covering the same material and with a different set of zones. But again, that mapping framework is usually drives a lot of these standards. So it's things like minimum lot size, setback requirements, so that buildings have to be set back a certain distance on a property, or there might be build to lines requiring that buildings be built to the property line. Typically, the setbacks and build to lines are serve two functions. One, for both, it's about character and maintaining character within streets or within neighborhoods where there is already some level of established streetscape and the way buildings have developed to create a cohesiveness about how streets and neighborhoods are developed. Setbacks can also be used to address mitigating incompatibility. So if there's something about certain types of uses in certain zones, it may just create for better neighbors if everything is set back a little more. But again, it can also create that cohesive character if all buildings are set back a certain distance. Lot width and lot frontage, that's about access from public streets. Not uncommon to see lot width requirements and road frontage. That's pretty common. And that in conjunction with minimum lot sizes are things that are considered related to subdivision approvals. So that whole, how lots can configure in and of themselves is covered in subdivision, and zoning would be the tool to help with that effort. Without zoning, it's difficult for a planning board to review a subdivision and make decisions on and tell somebody that they can't configure lots the way they're proposing if there's no zoning to help with that effort. We also see maximum lot coverage or imperviousness, addressing where how corner lots can be developed because they are in the unique position of having 2 front yards because they border 2 streets. There's height maximums often in zoning, but also height minimums. And you may have provisions that speak about height in terms of stories as well as actual linear feet. And again, height can be defined in the building code differently than in local zoning. So it's really important to check to see how height is measured. And hopefully you have a definition for that because it can change from community to community. It can also address density, how many units are permitted per square footage, based on the size of the lot. So that can also be covered. We often see graphics in zoning updates. More and more we're seeing graphic illustrations of how to convey a lot of this information, which is great because it is sometimes a lot easier to visualize things, to understand things if there's a visual reference. But do remember that the text is king here. So whatever the text provisions say is what is required. And then a caution about methods of measurement. This is where we do see some, often there can be a lack of clarity in terms of how certain provisions are measured. So if you do have vague language, like with everything else, somebody's going to need to interpret that and then apply that interpretation consistently. And as long as they do that and the method of measurement makes sense, they would probably be fine if that were ever challenged in court. But you do want to have that. You do want to make sure that that you're checking your code to make sure it does not, that it provides, because it should provide methods of measurement for anything that needs a measurement. And it might be in the definition section or written into the language itself. But if it is vague, that will be something that will be first interpreted by the zoning enforcement officer or again, the ZBA later on. And again, just be consistent and document how you came to the decision on that method of measurement. And here's an example of a dimensional table. This is very common in zoning. In this case, we have the zoning districts across the top, and then all the different types of dimensional considerations across the left column. In this particular zoning, I think this is the village of Louville. They cover everything from minimum lot size and minimum frontage. There's minimum and maximum front yard setbacks. There's, in some zones, some minimum and maximum height. So they were looking to not just, in some zones, they were concerned about character, so they wanted minimum heights. They cover accessory buildings on the last line of this table. So this is a pretty comprehensive table as an example. A tip here, you'll often see asterisks or footnotes in tables. Don't overlook those. They might provide some really key provisions that are then listed like this one at the bottom of the table. That could be specific regulations that need to be followed. And this may be the only location where those regulations are stated. So it's really important that you actually take in those footnotes It can be easy to just skip right by them, and so we mention it so that you don't do that, because often there's some important stuff there. And then, like with pre-existing uses, we just want to touch on that. For pre-existing non-conforming lots, so these would be lots that would have existed at the time new zoning was adopted, where maybe the lot characteristics don't meet the new zoning law. Might be minimum lot size or frontage, maybe even lot depth. So they could be, the term undersized lot of record might be used in your zoning, or non-conforming lots. There's a variety of different terms used. Unlike the not pre-existing non-conforming uses, lot size or lot dimensional nonconformities are not expressly protected. So if you do not allow for those sites to be developed, if you don't have language that allows for these lots to be developed, then before they could be developed, they would need to seek variances and area variances for relief from the zoning standards. There are a lot of zoning regulations that provide for some level of development. Sometimes it's if you can meet the setbacks, you can still develop the property, or other language like that. You see this a lot around our lakes in New York State, especially where there was once, you know, like this example on the screen, where there are a lot of really small lots. Then zoning gets put in place sometime thereafter, and so maybe, you know, a lot of the lots around a lake might not be conforming, but they do need to go through the process. There are provisions within the area variance criteria that talk about when a situation is not self-created, and that's a criteria to allow for variances when it is not a self-created hardship. So, or you know, this scenario was not self-created, like would be in the case of a new zoning. So there are outlets for dealing with those, but they are not protected the same way that that pre-existing uses are protected. And then lastly, before I turn it back over to Paula, site plan review is typically part of the dimensional consideration. It is a rendering, drawing, or sketch of a proposed project. Site plan review might be included in zoning, but it also, as Paula mentioned earlier, could be a standalone law that is used without zoning. But this course is about zoning. So if it's a separate law, it might still pertain. It's important that there be those cross-references in order for it to work well. Certainly site plan review is a lot easier if you have zoning, in the sense that there are already prescribed requirements for development that may not exist if there isn't zoning, so it's a lot more challenging to be a review board reviewing site plan review without zoning. But it can be done, and that's because there should be criteria in the site plan review law or section that talks about the criteria that you're reviewing a project against, and use that criteria to ensure that the project will meet the what is proposed in that project is adequately addressed based on the criteria in your local zoning law or in the site plan review law. Again, the ZEO interprets whether or not a project or land use activity requires a site plan review, and it should be spelled out either in the site plan law or zoning, those activities that trigger the review. And then prior to a building permit, site plan review will need to be approved before a building permit is issued. And zoning, all aspects of zoning must be complied with in terms of the proposed land activity prior to issuing an approval for a site plan review. So if something within the project does not meet zoning, then variances would need to be approved, sought and approved prior to approving that site plan review and allowing that project to move forward. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Paula.
Excellent.
Oh,
sorry, this is Chris. I just thought maybe before we switch speakers, the two of you might address just a couple questions, kind of open-ended questions briefly on that last, or broad questions on that last section that you went over, Monica. The first is, and it's a fairly basic question that I responded to somebody about, but because there are more than 300 people on, maybe you can just address it quickly. Who's responsible for amending the zoning? Who's responsible for keeping the zoning up?
So technically it would be your local governing boards. Your town board, village board of trustees, city council ultimately are responsible for updating, for adopting changes to zoning. Whether it's an ordinance or a law, they're responsible. So, but I would say as board members using zoning and as zoning enforcement officers using zoning and other staff, you know, if things are out of whack or if things are not clear, if things are not consistent with what you see on the ground or consistent with your comprehensive plan, that it's important that you sort of, you know, raise your concerns with your local governing board and let them know that you're, you think that there is a need for an update. And maybe it's not an overhaul, maybe it's a tweaking, but providing that information to local governing boards is honestly often your responsibility because you're the ones that work with it every day. And they're not necessarily going to realize that there are things that need adjusting.
Thank you, Monica. And then just one more. This was an interesting question, and I felt that it kind of relates to all of the zoning charts that you had up, the use and area standards that you had up. The question has to do with not applicable NA being in some of the columns, which I thought was a little odd because usually it's a pretty straightforward answer. Yes, no, the use needs site plan review, it needs special use permit, it's allowed as of right without any review and so forth. So can you say anything about that? I thought that was an interesting question. I can't think of an instance in which I've seen NA in one of those spreads that you had up.
Yeah.
You had, there was none in your examples. So can you think of why not applicable would appear on one of the in one of those?
Honestly, off the top of my head, I can't.
Okay, I feel better.
Yeah,
that you were stumped on that one too. I asked the questioner to send me an example.
I do think for the dimensional standards, I do think I have seen that before, and at the moment, I'm not sure I can think of what that might be, but I do feel like I have seen that before somewhere, and I'm racking my brain of what that might be, and if I think of it before the end of the presentation tonight, I'll think about some examples. But off the top of my head, I can't think of a need for why you would need to put NA in there. It might be a little bit redundant if it's, you know, to just say that this doesn't. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll have to give that some thought.
Yeah. Well, if it's pressing enough, the questioner will send us the example. But I just
okay. Yeah, that would be great.
Thanks.
Yeah, if they want to send it, that would be interesting.
Good. Thank you.
All right, so we'll talk a little bit about what some of the additional regulations of certain uses, especially if you find that you have some of these uses in your community that are a little bit more intensive to not just the land itself or the impact on the land, but maybe also the impact to some of the neighbors as well. So additional regulations may include specific standards or regulations that must be met and are usually reviewed by the zoning enforcement officer, and then as well as other criteria that might be more subjective and be part of a review like site plan review or special use permit is required that the zoning or planning board might be more apt to review itself. So these additional regulations are sometimes not really that obvious, as Monica kind of discussed a little bit earlier. Some of those zoning laws cross-reference additional regulations in the table of permitted uses or maybe list the uses, but sometimes that's not really common. Sometimes these can actually be in their own chapter of the zoning law or part of a very large supplemental regulations chapter in zoning that covers all of the land use topics that you might have. So depending on how long or complicated your zoning, these additional regulations can be sometimes pretty confusing to find. I'm a big proponent of the Control F, so finding the, looking for something specifically about accessory dwelling units. If you're lucky enough to have your regulations on like E-code 365 or 360, usually you can actually just type it in the search button yourself, which can be helpful. But sometimes just doing a search kind of can give you an idea if it pops up in any other, chapters in your zoning regulations. And I think to keep in mind here is those additional regulations have to be met unless, the applicant is granted relief. So what are some of the common examples that we see out there? And a lot of it has to do with housing, which, we definitely have a big housing crunch here in New York State. So municipalities, especially those that are considering the HCR pro-housing communities, are thinking about things like, how do we kind of build in things like accessory dwelling units? A lot of communities, one of the hot button issues that we're seeing is short-term rentals and the pressure on the long-term rental market as well. Things like manufactured housing parks or communities. You have to allow for manufactured housing in your community somewhere by zoning law, but sometimes those housing parks have additional regulations just because of things like, septic and water integrity. Other things that we've seen maybe since the days of COVID, things like the growth in home occupations. Obviously, renewable energy facilities remain a hot button land use across most of New York State. Then we have things like drive-through facilities, where I always kind of laugh these days about the way of zoning in the past and zoning in today's day. It's like the old days, the drive-throughs didn't light up, but now they have LED panels that you can see from space. So that's just one technology that you might want to consider, especially if you have one of these facilities right next to a residential area like I do in my neighborhood. Things like gas stations, which, in the past used to be a place where you could also get your oil changed. Nowadays, they're more like a place that you could pick up a bacon, egg, and cheese and 30 different kinds of beer or fill your growlers. You might be a community that has growth in not just short-term rentals, but things like campgrounds or what we call glamping now. We've kind of heard a little bit of it all. We'll talk about kennels specifically as the example in the next slide, or adult uses, which I think used to be a thing that people were kind of freaked out about in the 1990s. And you have to allow for them somewhere in your community because they are protected by First Amendment rights. But I think the internet has mostly taken care of that problem. I think one that we don't have on here that we're hearing a lot about right now is cannabis dispensaries as well, which is another one of those hot button issues that we're seeing across the state. So important to know where you can find those additional regulations, because obviously it's probably going to go through some additional review before they get permits to move ahead. So our example is kind of a boring one, and it's kind of hard because we're getting closer to 8 p.m. and I like to have a little bit of humor in our presentation. So, but this one is for kennels, which obviously if you are trying to live a quiet life next to a kennel, it might be kind of difficult in some communities. So an example for kennels for additional regulations. You'll see the first two are dimensional and will require an area variance if it wasn't met. So minimum lot size of 5 acres in all zones, and all kennels with outdoor exercise pens or runs shall locate all such pens and runs no closer than 300 feet to any adjoining property line. So again, trying to minimize the nuisance to the neighbors. And the secondary is more subjective and would probably be covered by a reviewing board as part of either site plan review or special use permits. So that's things like adequate landscaping or fencing should be provided to create a visual, sound, and odor buffer between such facility and adjacent properties. So again, something that probably will start with your zoning enforcement officer, just because that's usually how it goes, and then probably go through site plan or special use permit as well with your planning or zoning board. And then other supplemental regulations are for additional structures or site improvements that are associated with the primary use of the property. So these are often standards or guidelines that you're trying to proactively address any potential, impacts or nuisances. So things like, parking and loading, maybe lighting for safety, or things to support community character, like the building design itself, if you have a community, or if you have building design standards or guidelines in your community, and things like signage and lighting, so it just makes sense for people using the parcel after. Thing to keep in mind there, they're often lumped kind of into one big section of zoning, but not always. So again, sometimes hard to find, but that Control F, finding that throughout your zoning law can be really helpful. Another thing to keep in mind are standards versus guidelines. So standards are things that are elements that are required. So things like words like shall or must, there's more teeth in them. Whereas guidelines are more kind of elements that are encouraged and might be part of the negotiation of project review going back and forth. So sometimes you have a little bit more depending of that negotiation factor with, national change that are coming to your community. But standards are usually the strongest amount where you can kind of hold applicants to those standards in your law. If you're not willing to go full in on standards, guidelines are a good place to start. So keep that in mind. So those are supplemental regulations, and we like to say that the fancy dumpster on the upper right-hand side is so bougie that raccoons come from 4 different communities to enjoy the delights of said dumpster. So a little humor out there as we wind down this webinar. So some of the other permits and approvals to be aware of as we kind of move forward. Of course, there is the boundary or lot line adjustment. So this is where you're kind of changing the lot line, but you're not proposing any additional new lots. So example, Monica wants to dig the in-ground pool of her dreams. The only place to do it is unfortunately really close to my my property, so I might sell her 10 feet of my property so she can achieve the side setback requirements. That wouldn't require, it doesn't make a new lot, it would just be changing that lot line, so we call that a lot line adjustment. So local law might delegate this review to a planning board, or a lot of times larger municipalities that tend to have planning staff see this as an administrative function. So the zoning enforcement officer or the professional planner might actually be the one that looks over these. You should require a survey with any time that you're proposing lot lines. It just makes it easier for not just the municipality further down the line to make sure that what happened, but it makes it easier for your tax assessors as well. Make sure that you review your regulations about new lot configurations that still meet the zoning. So you don't want to make substandard lots more substandard. You want to try to make them more in line with the minimum standards for buildable lots in your community. So again, sometimes you're doing that. So looking at things like lot size, frontage, setbacks, lot coverage, again, depends on how you handle those in your community. So most common reasons for these, of course, are correcting a physical encroachment. These are the wild people in our communities that build things without permits and then come back and say, oh, well, I didn't know that I built my my she shed on Monica's property, so I guess I'm going to have to buy some property from her, or I'm going to be told to take it down. Sometimes we have legal disputes between neighbors. Sometimes this can kind of play out in the boundary or lot line adjustment, or you might be enlarging or trying to improve a substandard lot to meet those minimum standards for buildable lots. That's pretty difficult in those communities where the lots are really small. Back in the day, you need more space now, so you might have to kind of buy a little bit of property from all your neighbors to try to make it more, to make it less substandard and more with your minimum requirements. And then there is subdivision, which is kind of like the building blocks of development in most communities. It's the division of a parcel of land into lots, blocks, or sites with or without streets for the purposes of sale, transfer of ownership, or development. In some of our more rural communities, this might be some of the only development pressure that you're seeing. By state statute, it is reviewed and approved by the planning board, but usually the zoning enforcement officer is there to determine if the proposed lots will meet your zoning regulations prior to the planning board review, because then they know if it has to go to both the planning board and the zoning board of appeals for variances. Sometimes that happens with things like minimum lot size or lot width or road frontage, especially if you're a community that has some of those old cul-de-sacs where you might have a irregular frontage that's, you know, smaller around the circle than the property in the back. Though we're trying to encourage more connectivity in a lot of our communities, so there's always kind of a second way to get out when things happen. And sometimes things like lot depth as well. So really the kind of important thing is most likely the zoning enforcement officer is going to talk to the applicant first about whether, you know, kind of explain the process to them. So they're going to go to both the planning board, they might have to go to the zoning board of appeals as well. Hopefully, there's a good working relationship between the planning board and the zoning board of appeals. You really should be working together, kind of offering guidance, especially as you look at these applications that might require work in front of both boards. So just kind of keep in mind there, that's subdivision in a nutshell. Also, I don't think we mentioned this, but all of these little blue boxes full of statutes all pertain to, you know, your service and your community. So if you're in a city, you worry about general city law. If you're in town, you worry about town law. If you're in village law, you worry about village law. And all of them are in our Guide to Planning and Zoning Laws publication of New York State. So really helpful, especially if you're kind of new to the board. It's good to have around just because subdivision especially is probably the most prescriptive of the land use regulations in statute. So sometimes you want to just kind of get familiar with those statutes in your service as well. All right, I will get off my soapbox now. Then there is planned unit development or planned development districts. So zoning might include a floating zone tool that allows for the creation of planned development or planned unit district developments. And this tool allows for an alternative mix of land uses and development configurations than what is otherwise permitted through rezoning of the property for a specific project that comes before the municipality. This tool usually comes with a set of criteria that are necessary to achieve for the tool to be used, such as like minimum land area, or they might be only allowed to do a planned unit development in certain underlying zoning districts. And what's important here is the process has to be spelled out in your zoning law. It typically requires a rezoning whereby the planned unit development will replace the original zoning that was lying underneath of that area with the specific project's land uses and development. So because it requires a zoning amendment, that means that it has to go to your local governing board. So typically the first step is the applicant is applying for the PDD through the local governing board, who will then seek and should seek the recommendation from the planning board. And remember, planning boards have both advisory and regulatory roles. Subdivision is a regulatory role because it's specifically granted to you through state statutes, but it also has advisory roles, which means that you're providing not only the Zoning Board of Appeals with kind of guidance about, what's going on in your community, but you're also advising your local governing board as well, which is really important because you are probably seeing things on the ground that maybe your town board really isn't seeing. So keep those lines of communications open between the boards. And then finally, the fun part, Monica's going to take us through some examples to kind of wrap us up here and kind of take this whole thing home.
All right, thanks, Paula. All right, so we have two examples here at the end, which is, and these were set up in a way in the scenario where somebody has an idea for a project. One is more specific and well-developed potentially than the other, and they're contacting your municipality to see whether or not they'd be able to move forward, or maybe they assume that they can move forward and they've come in with an application. So the first step in the process is what we're going to cover here in these examples of looking through zoning to understand how projects would apply, how you would apply specific projects using local zoning. So our first example is a proposed mixed-use building on a vacant 6,543 square foot riverfront lot. So this would be an infill project in a village where there is a considerable amount of development. It is a riverfront property, and the community has zoning in place, significant zoning in place to work with. And so the applicant has potentially been able to looked at that zoning because this is a project that you might do your homework on before you are considering purchasing a lot. You're probably going to do your homework to make sure that anything that you have in mind might be doable. So that's probably the scenario in most communities, that somebody coming into in a scenario like this would have that in mind. But in this particular case, they're looking to build a 2-story, 5,000 square foot gross floor area building. So the footprint of the building will be 2,500 square feet. And the first floor would hold a restaurant/bar with outdoor seating because, of course, it's on the river, so that would be a feature to draw people in. On the second floor would be 2 small apartments. And the proposal is planning to have 8 off-street parking spaces as part of the project. So the first step would be to consult the zoning map to figure out whether or not the proposed uses would be permitted. So here we locate the property on the zoning map, and we see that it would be allowed that it is located in the downtown mixed use zone, the DMU, as well as it's part of the waterfront overlay, which is the hatched lines that you see sort of on the map. So both zones are going to need to be considered when looking into this project. The second step would then be to look at whether or not the uses as proposed are permitted in that downtown mixed use district. So you would go to, in this case, the table of permitted uses and go to the DMU zone and then look for land use activity terms that fit the activities that are proposed by the applicant. So I don't have the whole table on the screen here, but for example, you see that dwelling units above first floor street level only are permitted in this zone. If you were to go down the list of uses and you see like single family homes or two family homes, those are not permitted uses in this zone, and that's probably because the intention of a downtown mixed use areas is to have a mix of uses in buildings or maybe more like small scale apartment buildings, and is less suited for single and two family homes because this is a more commercially driven area. So if you were to go down the rest of this table, you would see that bars and restaurants are also both permitted. So residents, the restaurant and bar are permitted as of right, but with site plan review, as well as and the residential above first floor commercial would also be a permitted use. None of these uses require a special use permit, so that would not be required here. And then this table also includes cross-references to any additional regulations. So at this time you could check that, and that would give you a heads up as to whether there would be anything else you'd have to consider with regard to these uses. In this case, there were no additional regulations required in relation to any of the permitted uses or the proposed uses in this project. In terms of the waterfront overlay, that's not on the table. So to understand what the provisions are for the waterfront overlay, you would look at the text of the zoning, and you would, in looking at that, you would see that the activities proposed here would be allowed in that waterfront overlay. However, the building location may require a special use permit review of the project if it's not set back at least 50 feet from the high water mark. So that is something that the applicant will have to take into consideration in terms of where they plan to build that structure. And then encircled in blue here, because this table does not put demarcations for each use that requires special use permits, it states that any land use activity may also require a site plan review per a certain section. When you go to that section, you would see that there is a short list of exempt uses, land use activities from site plan review, and anything that's not exempt does require site plan review. And that is something you might have in your zoning, because that is a common way to handle those site plan review activities. So then the next step would be to look at what the dimensional requirements are. So in this particular case, they have a table, and when you go to the downtown mixed use zone, you see that there is no minimum lot size or minimum lot width in this zone. That can be quite common in downtowns that are looking to create flexibility for infill development, so it allows more flexible arrangement of things on a lot, and usually there's more of a focus on setbacks and maybe build two lines to make sure that while there aren't those lot requirements, lot size requirements or lot width requirements, that there are still typically setback considerations or build two lines, and both exist in this case. There is also a minimum height requirement of 2 stories and then a maximum height of 3.5 stories or 40 feet. So this is an area, again, where they're thinking about character and wanted to see at least 2-story buildings, which is more in keeping with some of the surrounding buildings. And then they have some typical requirements related to side and rear yards. Notice that there's a 30-foot setback requirement for the rear yard. So that would be what would be required from the property line without that waterfront overlay provision. So in addition to so it would be 30 feet, but if they want to, in this particular case, in the waterfront, because of the waterfront overlay, they will actually have to consider a 50-foot setback or seek a special use permit. So it's not to say that the special use permit wouldn't be provided. And then the other provision here is, will the project, they do have a maximum imperviousness of 70%, which is considerable lot coverage, but included in that is building and parking. Depending upon where they're at, they might need to consider whether or not they would have what the materials would be for that outdoor seating area, so as not to create more imperviousness. So that's something they would have to consider. And then in addition to those standards, this particular zoning code also has supplemental regulations, a section on that covers things like some basic design standards. There's a section on stormwater management because it is a fairly built-out community on a water body, and they're concerned about stormwater, runoff, pollution, et cetera. So they have standards associated with that. They do have off-street parking requirements. In this particular scenario, the parking requirements included by the applicant would meet the zoning requirements. This zoning also has a parking maximum, so there's a cap, and this project stays under the cap but does meet the minimum as proposed. There are possible bike parking requirements depending upon the size of the parking lot for cars. There's signage, lighting, landscaping. All of those things would also need to be considered as part of this project. And there's also a need to consider public access for as part of that waterfront overlay. It does not require public access, but it requires that the applicant consider providing it, and that would be a discussion that would take place with the planning board, probably under any sort of review for site plan review, or maybe that special use permit. All right, our second example is quite a different example, and this is one of those scenarios where somebody might have an idea in their mind and they're thinking about it, but they haven't done a lot of homework, and they make a call to town hall to get some information about what is allowed in the community. I think people get a lot of these calls. And so this is where an applicant is proposing to convert a portion of their home into a salon, while the remainder of the home will be their residence. They're proposing a 350 square foot salon area. The house itself is 2,500 square feet. They're thinking they may have 1 employee in the future, with daily customers, obviously, to run this business. They haven't determined what their hours of operation would be, but obviously that's something they need to consider, and they didn't really think about parking when they were thinking about this project. So the first step would be to look at that zoning map. This is the same zoning map that we had earlier in the presentation. Hypothetically, in this scenario, this property is located in the R residential zone. So the next step will be, of course, to look at the table of uses. And so here I've included both pages from the table, or parts of the table. And in going, so you're going to go down, you're going to locate the residential zoning district, and then you're going to go down the list of uses looking for something that is terminology associated with home-based businesses or mixed businesses or salons that would be maybe allowed even in a residential zone. The term home occupation is commonly known. So you're going down through the list of uses. In this particular case, the first thing that came up was co-location. Because there would be two uses of this property, could co-location pertain to this use? So we hold that. We see home occupation type 1, home occupation type 2, and salons and those types of uses were not a permitted use per se in this zone. So so then the next step would be to look at the definitions of these three uses to see whether or not they would pertain. The co-location definition, it turns out had to do with cell towers, which is not surprising. So that is obviously nothing to do with having a salon in a home. Then then the definition of home occupation type 1 did talk about many aspects of what this applicant is proposing, but was silent on the issue of whether or not you could have customers. So it was hard you can't tell necessarily whether this would be considered a type 1, but it's possible. Then when you looked at the definition of type 2, uses, type 2 home occupations that are allowed with a special use permit, the definition is similar, but does include additional numbers of employees and allows for customers and entertainment on site. So clearly that client-customer component is part of home occupation 2. So at the very least, it looks like that's what would be permitted, would be this use with a special use permit. So then the next thing would be to figure out whether or not there are any additional regulations related to the use. As Paula suggested earlier, a search might warrant be the fastest way to find out whether home occupations have additional regulations, because in this case there wasn't that cross-reference to the different types of uses. So a search on it did pop up the term home occupation under supplemental regulations, and it broke down some requirements that would pertain to any home occupation, whether it was a type 1 or 2, and then some things that applied only to type 2 home occupations. So I'll take the second bullet here first. There is a limit on the floor area based on the principal dwelling size that required a maximum of only 25% of the dwelling to be used. In this particular case, the project would meet that because it's under 25%. That would apply to any home occupation. Then they had a limit of 1 employee for type 1 home occupations, 3 employees for type 2, no customers for type 1 home occupations, but customers are allowed for type 2. There are regulations for hours of operation that are 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. So that's something that this applicant would need to consider, because a salon may need to be open in the evening, so this might impact how she feels about this proposal. And there was considerations for signage for a type 2, no sign allowed for a type 1, and then off-street parking is determined by the planning board for the type 2. So the zoning enforcement officer is going to make a determination that this requires a special use permit, and that there are that it meets zoning when it comes to the size of the proposal. But some of the squishier things like hours of operation and off-street parking are probably going to be needed to be reviewed and discussed as part of that special use permit to determine whether or not the project will meet that, because it's possible that this person would want to do something outside of those hours of operation. So that's just sort of 2 quick projects walking through how you would start the process for reviewing zoning for particular activities. if that's helpful to in thinking about using your zoning. And then just to wrap up, one slide here on tips and best practices. This is just a reiteration of some things. Apply zoning as written. Use definitions of terms in the zoning law, not necessarily common meanings of terms, unless, of course, there isn't a definition, and then you're going to have to use some form of common meanings. Be consistent when interpreting zoning language. Remember that the ZBA is a resource for interpretations. Maintain good records of all your zoning determinations and interpretations. We will always remind our boards, review boards, to make good records for all of your decisions. Consider requesting a part-time review board's secretary or clerk to assist with administrative responsibilities if there's not enough staff and it's clear that there's not enough staff. Keep a list of zoning language that's unclear and problematic or missing for future updates. And then remember to communicate with your local governing board that it's time, that there are things that should be updated, because you're the ones that would be most knowledgeable about that, as we talked about earlier. And that wraps up this training, and I see that it's 7:59 by my computer's standards. So I am going to leave this slide to Paula.
As a reminder, the certificates will be emailed in the next week. Please don't send a million emails to our administrator about when you're going to get a certificate. Johnny is on the line with us tonight. It just kind of slows down the process for everybody. The certificates will include a link for the training, especially if you got them from last week. They went out. You should have them by now. The next ones will also
went out Friday.
To the recording. Again, thank you for your service to your communities. Thank you for joining us for training. It's really important. If you know new board members are going to be joining you in the next year, the next 2 and 3 actually webinars we're doing in January is the overviews, Planning Board and Zoning Board of Appeals overviews. So if you need a refresher or you know new board members, have them join us for that. Those are open. Chris, did you want to go over anything? This is the most important slide of all the slides.
There's also the
contact information.
Paula just mentioned the training on the 22nd for staff.
Yes, and the last we will do, the last webinar of the series is Essentials for Planning Board, or for board staff and municipal staff. So we'll be doing that during the day. So for those, clerks, secretaries, zoning enforcement officials, etc., feel free to join us for that one. Are we missing anything, or is there anything that you weren't able to cover, Chris, that we should just touch on? I see a lot of incompatibility of office, but...
Yes, the only questions that I want to raise and just speak about very briefly are the incompatibility of office. People who have questions for incompatibility of office should give us a call during regular business hours, because some of them were about somebody serving on both the Planning Board and the Zoning Board of Appeals. Some were about serving on the Planning Committee or the Zoning Revision Committee and the Zoning Board of Appeals.
Yeah,
and all of those are okay, because they're not, one isn't the boss of the other, and they're not kind of in conflict. So you're not appealing your own decision. You're making recommendations on the Planning Committee. And on the, if you really have a need for somebody who's willing to serve on both boards, while you're waiting to find a more permanent member of the Zoning Board of Appeals, let's say, and a member of the Planning Board is willing to fill that seat, we recommend that applications that come before both boards not be voted on twice by one person. So that person would say, well, my service on the ZBA is more valuable because that board has more trouble getting a quorum, so I'll vote in my capacity as a ZBA member. but they're not incompatible. You can serve on both boards.
Yeah.
Deal.
That goes back to very old opinions of the Attorney General's office from like the 1950s. And yes, they find that there's no incompatibility there. So, of course, we don't have those because they're like the very original opinions that were put out. But there is a Fordham Law, like 1957 or 59, law review article that actually goes over it. So it's usually where we point people to. But we typically also just don't encourage that because, you know, it does make it a little bit harder when you have applications that have to do business before both boards.
And we wouldn't want to subject any member to all those meetings. And,
oh my gosh, right?
but if there's somebody out there willing to do it while boards are looking for new members, that's really great. So the other question that came up, and it came up a couple times and I responded to it in each instance, has to do with home-based businesses. The code, the residential code has a provision in it that caps the amount of square footage or the percentage of the residence that can be used for the home-based business. And that confused me and some of our other colleagues when we first discovered it also. But what it means is the code isn't saying you can't use more of your residence for your home-based business. The code is saying if you use more of your residence than this amount, then the residential code no longer applies, and a different code, the commercial code or whatever code applies to whatever you're doing is with your home-based business, kicks in. So if anybody's confused by that, just give us a call. I'll leave it there.
Nice.
Yep, that's great.
Okay.
All right.
Well, happy holidays, everyone. I can't believe it's the week of Christmas already. Time has been flying. Again, thank you for coming for training and for your service to your boards. We know it is a thankless job in many communities. Not the easiest job to do either. So we hope that you stay happy and healthy and safe, and we will talk to you in 2026. Join us again and reach out if you have any questions. Otherwise,
thanks, everyone.
Have a good night.